to introduce our panelists. Angela Alaimo O'Donnell is a writer, poet, and professor. She teaches English, creative writing, and courses in Catholic studies at Fordham University in New York City, and serves as Associate Director of Fordham's Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. She is also co-editor of the Curran Center's new book series, Studies in the Catholic Imagination, the Flannery O'Connor Trust Series, published by Fordham University Press. Mark Bosco is a Jesuit priest, professor, and authority on the works of Flannery O'Connor and Graham Greene. His award-winning documentary film, Flannery, The Storied Life of the Writer from Georgia, premiered nationwide on PBS just 2 days ago. Mark's most recent book is Graham Greene's Catholic Imagination, published by Oxford University Press. He is the Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And moderating our conversation today is John Sweeney, our publisher here at Paraclete. Thanks so much to all of you. I'm going to turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be with you. Thank you, everyone, for joining people from all over the country and including at least one other continent, which is delightful. Thank you to Angela for being here, Angela, who we proudly publish. Thank you to Mark for being here, who we don't yet proudly publish, but he's here just because he's gracious and he's kind. And he's the filmmaker of the documentary that maybe many of you saw on PBS on Tuesday night, and we will get to that. Let me just mention a couple of housekeeping things. One is, if you look on your Zoom screen, you'll see the chat function. If you want to say something either kind or nasty to me, you can write it in the chat and I will see it. If you see the Q&A and you want to pose a question, when we get to at least the 35-minute point in this presentation, I'll start looking at that and we will get some of your questions, hopefully get all of them, but we will do as well as we can. So my intention is to ask some questions that get Angela and Mark talking with each other and talking with us. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to sort of start off with a bang, with a question that won't surprise either Mark or Angela, but I find it an interesting way to begin, which is, why do so many young, and by young I mean under the age of 50, Catholic writers, Christian writers and Catholic specifically writers, so often say to me and to you, stop talking to me about Flannery O'Connor?
I've never experienced that in my life, John. Maybe I woo them by overwhelming them with why they should be reading Flannery O'Connor. But I don't know, Angela, you want to take that one first?
Well, I have heard talk indirectly. They don't usually say that to me, but I have heard talk that people want to stop conversations about Flannery O'Connor because she's in the past and this is the present. And let's face it, she is this huge, she casts a huge shadow. She is she's like James Joyce for the Irish. You know, you really, if you're an American Catholic writer, you cannot get around Flannery O'Connor. And I think there's the anxiety of influences partially there, sense of never being able to measure up to that. And you know, as long as we keep talking about that as the standard, then we're not really going to be able to recognize the burgeoning talent that is with us right now. So I think for some writers, there is that overwhelming sense of her presence behind them that they would like to forget about while they're trying to practice their craft. So I think that's part of the reason, at least.
Yeah, and yet you have to go through her. I remember the line that in the film, did make it in our film, Tobias Wolff, when he was still running the writers, the MFA program at Stanford. He says, you know, we in our classes, we do Flannery O'Connor. And I said, listen, you don't have to become Flannery O'Connor, but you better go through her to get to the other side, because you will learn so much about the craft of writing. You cannot help it. It's just there. So I wish we could have had that line in the film. It didn't have a space with our 20, 30 hours of film. But I think that's why that she's still important. And those who are under 50, yeah, you don't ever want to become Flannery O'Connor. You have your own creativity, of your own voice. You have your own sense of the literary imagination. But not only does she enlarge, but you can learn something on the way. with Flannery O'Connor. And so I see that it's really important. John LaRue said the same thing to me before he passed about Flannery O'Connor. So Mary Carr says the same thing. So the people who are writers, they appreciate the fact that you don't become this writer, and if you do, then you're copying, right? Right,
Exactly,
Angela?
yeah. When I teach creative writing, and students ask, how do I get to be a better writer? I tell them, well, you read as much as you can. And they're worried about they're going to be overly influenced, and they're going to pick up stuff from other writers. And if I, of course, quote T.S. Eliot to them, who says, good poets borrow, great poets steal. The reason that you're reading all of these voices is because you figure out what kinds of stuff you can learn to do yourself and incorporate into your own work. And inevitably, your work is going to echo those voices.
Yeah.
Whenever I write as a poet, I feel like everybody's in the room with me. Shakespeare's there, Keats is there, Wordsworth's there, Frost is there, Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, like they're all there with me, that my communion of writings, and I'm writing along, I'm accompanying them, I'm writing with them in my own voice, adding my own voice to the choir. But, I have to know who those people are, or else, I'm not going to be able to develop as a writer. So, but I do think there's a certain amount of anxiety on the part of young writers that they really don't want to replicate what's already been done, and they think that the way to do that, some at least, is not to expose themselves too much to those other writers who are the greats.
Right. To that point, Randy Boyagoda, who has a new Catholic novel out, he came once and gave a talk saying, please stop talking. It titled, "Please stop talking about Flannery O'Connor." And of course, it was tongue in cheek because he says, I'm a Sri Lankan Canadian writing from my, milieu. But he would say the same thing. We have to stand on her shoulders. We don't have to just kind of keep on pushing our stuff, our imaginations into her mind or into her craft. Yeah. Didn't Eliot also say the best way to get to know a work of art is to put it next to another work of art? Mm-hmm. So, there is this sense that, O'Connor, she's a great short story writer. There's just probably the best in the 20th century. If you want to write short stories, make sure you've read them, So I think it is funny though, because there's now Catholic science fiction stuff coming out. There's certainly other writers that are located in Latinx communities, Canadian communities, you might say. And in many ways, O'Connor's essays kind of say, we have a universal kind of a quality to this Catholic faith that will now be particularized in your talent and in your place. So that's what I would say.
Well, thank you, both of you. Now, my
defensive at the beginning here. I'm sorry, gosh.
My second question, it's going to take me a little while to ask it, so just bear with me for a minute. So Ralph Wood, who features in Mark's film, longtime professor at Baylor University, wrote an influential book on Flannery perhaps 15 or so years ago. And it was based on a presupposition that I remember 15 or so years ago sort of bristling at myself. And the presupposition was that O'Connor was or is the only great Christian writer that the US has ever produced. I remember Ralph Wood naming Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne and Melville and Dickinson and Frost and Stevens, and then saying something like, none of them were Christian, or at least not Orthodox Christian. So that's, I'm getting to my question. Don't you think that to understand Flannery, you have to understand the Christian idea of original sin? And that's part one of my question. The second part is, I suspect that most people today would be a whole lot more comfortable identifying as Christian in the ways of Emerson, Thoreau, and Emily Dickinson instead of in the way of Flannery O'Connor. What do you think?
Interesting question. Well, it certainly helps knowing that O'Connor is a Catholic and knowing that she believes in, as she says, she writes about the three last things, death, redemption, and the judgment. That's at the center of everything that she writes. And not knowing that, I think, can lead some people astray. As you probably know, her famous line where she says, about people who misunderstand her book, Wise Blood, There are a lot of people who think that I'm a hillbilly nihilist when I'm really a hillbilly Thomist. They think that she's somebody who doesn't believe in anything, when of course, because she features characters who claim not to believe in anything. But of course, that's not the case. As John Huston put it in the film, Mark's film the other night, Jesus always wins. There is this sense in which, the characters who think that they don't believe in anything, it turns out that they do. Even those who seem to have gone as far astray as it's possible to go from God, those who are committing murder, those who are in every way violating the moral code that we live in as human beings, there's still, such as the broadness of God's mercy, that God is still pursuing them, and they in some way can be redeemed ultimately if they wise up and understand what's happening to them. That's O'Connor's vision, and that vision is in every story in some form or other. Not to know that, not to have that as background, I think does lead some people to misunderstand the stories. Sometimes I think the things that they like about them are not the things that are the really important things. I think it's interesting, for example, that the Coen brothers, their films are very O'Connor-esque. They have taken her idea of, and they talk about a great example of two writers who have learned a lot from another writer and done something different with it. They create these films that, use the kind of crazy, hilarious humor next to the most horrific events and put them up against each other. But at the end of the movies, they don't believe in anything. There is no vision that's behind all of this. They just like the slick trick of using those things. I love the Coen brothers, by the way, but I don't think that they give us the truth in the way that O'Connor is trying to give us the truth. So yeah, I think that it's really necessary and extremely, if not absolutely necessary, very important to be able to know this about O'Connor, and in order to really understand what it is that she's doing in the stories.
Yeah, I totally agree, Angela. I mean, I would, this idea that, there was not Christian literature until Flannery. I mean, certainly O'Connor says that she finds herself in Hawthorne's community in her own writing. So what I find fascinating about Flannery O'Connor is that she comes out of this moment of a revival of a kind of a Catholic intellectual light, at the same time that the world is coming out of the trauma of World War II and atomic holocausts and Jewish holocausts. And so this existential kind of sense of crisis is there. She can be, you can argue that there's something nihilistic. I would say it's deconstructive because she's reconstructing something else or giving a horizon for something else. But you can see that that's what people kind of glean onto, or the way that violence happens. But here's the thing that I think, if Dr. Wood is right, I would say this: what O'Connor understands from her Catholic faith is what is suffering. Suffering, we have such a hard time in our Protestant American imagination what to do with suffering. Get rid of it, inebriate ourselves about it, fix it. That's the American way, right? Fix it. O'Connor's Catholicism, her sense of what it means to be Orthodox, is that suffering is with us. It's not going away, and it can be the channel, the container, the way to insight, revelation, acceptance, beauty. The cross is not a beautiful thing, but you have to understand something that can be made beautiful because of God, right? So what O'Connor has that the others don't, that Hawthorne doesn't have, that Melville, all those, is that her Catholic faith, she lived suffering through her lupus. She lived suffering in many different physical ways, but she understood suffering as a way to God. And I think that is so revolutionary and remarkable because she makes her characters suffer. she shakes them and her readers up. Usually at their own petard, you might say. She is unique in that regard. But boy, does she I think she comes out of that Hawthorne's world. last thing I'd say is that I had a student, I think I've shared this actually at a couple of conferences. Students said, what is it about Flannery O'Connor in Catholicism? And this kid said, well, you know, we've read all of her stories, and if you didn't know that she was Catholic, it would be like just eating the whipped cream on a banana sundae. If you did, if that's all, if you didn't know that she was Catholic, you would just get all that stuff that's, but to get to the ice cream and the banana, you have to know Catholicism, and it's just a richer dessert. So I kind of like that.
And to speak to your, I absolutely agree that the suffering is central in lots of great books by great American Catholic writers. I was just thinking of, I teach William Kennedy's book Ironweed every other semester. Beautiful book about suffering. And you know, he's a deep Irish Catholic, even though he's not a practicing Catholic right now. But there's no doubt that book is from word one about suffering and the desire for redemption and how it is that you achieve redemption. And the suffering itself that the main character goes through is ultimately redemptive. There's scenes in that book where, you know, he looks around and he realizes that the whole world is blessed, a bathroom or blessed, so that a bath is a baptism. He has a profoundly sacramental imagination. And he has this in common with O'Connor. And I think, but O'Connor is so, she's very, very intentional about the importance and the goodness of suffering. When she talks about her faith, you know, a lot of people, there are people who think, oh, O'Connor, you know, she's such a big Catholic, you know, as the comment was made when in 1971 to Robert Giroux, when her book was presented with the National Book Award, her collected stories, as if being a big Catholic somehow made you some kind of a pansy, you know, a person who didn't really have to deal with the difficulties of life. And as Flannery says in one of her letters, she says a lot of people think that faith is a big electric blanket, and it's really the cross. That it's hard to be a Catholic. It's hugely challenging. It's overwhelming in terms of what it demands of you, and the centrality of suffering, you know, is something that from infancy, you know, when I visited the Flannery O'Connor childhood home a couple of years ago, hanging over Flannery's little crib. The crib is up against the wall underneath the window. Outside the window is St. John's Cathedral, where Flannery was baptized, and then hanging on the wall is a crucifix with a body on it. So little tiny Flannery lying in her crib would look up, you know, see the church out the window, see the body of the suffering, tortured man on the wall, and understood that, oh my goodness, death is absolutely central to my family's life, to this human life, from the time that she's very young. This reminds me of a poem. Could I read a poem? Just really quickly. It's about this idea of Catholic children from very early age understanding mortality, having to come to terms with mortality. And it's a little poem from this book, Andalusian Hours, that Paraclete Press has wonderfully published. She says in one of her conversations, she says, I'm a born Catholic, and death has always been brother to my imagination. And this is called Flannery's Twin. I'd be an only child, except for him, sleeping in my room with me at night, our twin beds side by side. When we toss the rock for hopscotch, he always rolls a 10. One-footed, I teeter and bend to snatch that stone and hop home safe and whole. Whatever game we've played, he's never lost. Quick at jacks, sharp at cards, fast and light on his feet when we jump rope. My role as his sister is to keep him amused. He should grow bored and try to leave. I tell him stories, make him believe he is invincible, when he is not. He's a fool, but he's the only brother I've got. And I think what I'm trying to capture in that poem is that sense of O'Connor as feeling this a very strange kind of fellow feeling with death and mortality from a very young age, taking it very seriously, and it can't help but manifest itself in her stories and in the world that she creates in them.
Yeah, and I think linking it to Angela, to what you said, that it's not suffering for suffering's sake. It's suffering as a redemptive path. And I think that's one of the things that we have a difficulty with in American, and just our American myth, right? That suffering is the redemptive path. I think she, like Walker Percy, would say, we have a difficulty with tragedy in the American psyche. I think Emerson is I think trying to remove himself from that. I think Melville is trying to engage it right there with the whale.
Yeah.
I think that Hawthorne is going to psychologize it and dramatize it and romanticize it. And I think O'Connor really does kind of come out of that notion of suffering as a
Yeah, I
redemptive.
like the way that you brought up of Hawthorne. I was just talking with my students about this the other day, that Hawthorne, I mean, Flannery calls herself a romancer, and Hawthorne is one of her, her predecessors. She definitely feels she's ready because she knows at some level that he was a closet Catholic. He was fiercely anti-Catholic. One of my favorite horrible things that he said when he was in the consulate over in Liverpool, which was full of Irish people, Irish Catholics who had, got left Ireland and come to Liverpool to work in the textile industry. And he was so disgusted. He looked out the window and he said, "Look at them all the Irish Catholics. They're like maggots in cheese." So he has this fiercely anti-Catholic attitude. But when you read the Scarlet Letter, there she is up on the scaffold, right, holding her baby. He describes her as a Madonna. His imagination is totally seduced by the Catholic imagination, and his books are full of it. Even though, as you say, he's not really sure about whether this suffering is redemptive. But once again, Jesus wins in this story, because as we know, Hawthorne's daughter Rose converted to Catholicism. She worked with women who were suffering from cancer in New York City and established an order of nuns that are located here in New York in a little town called Hawthorne, just about 15 miles from here. So he was a very slow boat to Rome, but he was definitely on a slow boat to Rome. And there's an element of Flannery knows that that's part and parcel of his imagination, I think, and it's why he's one of her go-to writers.
Yeah.
So, all right. So so far we've had Thomism, we've had redemptive suffering, we've had nihilistic ideas and apocalyptic visions. Maybe we should also back up and add some more biography. In Mark's film on PBS on Tuesday night, I saw two of our greatest novelists, Alice McDermott, say the illness made her the writer she was. And I saw Mary Gordon say there would have been no Flannery O'Connor without her leaving Georgia. So those are kind of hints at some of these biographical elements. But could the two of you kind of flesh her out a little bit?
Absolutely. And as we talk about the film, I started the series on the film after reading Angela's book, Fiction Fired by Faith, which really does a great job of that biography too, with the stories. And I say that because I think definitely O'Connor had to learn craft. I mean, she had a lot of talent, right? And what Iowa gave her was the ability to hone craft, to have others who were as smart and as talented as her to critique. And she was a darling of so many of the professors because they saw the craft and they saw that she continually got better at the craft while she was there. So I do think that she had to leave Georgia. It would have been a different kind of writing. She might have still been a cartoonist for all we know if she had never left Georgia. But it was really, I think Iowa was a necessary place for her to kind of stake her ground, put the flag down. I'm going to be this kind of writer. I'm not going to be a journalist. And that's going to be very, that I need help in some ways. And so, she gets help. She reads a lot in Iowa. And she reads what? She reads those authors that are kind of part of that Catholic imagination. She reads a lot of Dostoevsky. She reads Gogol. She's reading a lot more. She's reading a lot of the French Catholic writers for the first time that have just been translated when she gets there, right after the war. So Peggy and Bernanos and Mauriac and Maritain, all those folks who are really gonna help shape her. And of course, she takes on her own in her journal, her prayer journal. She kind of takes on kind of recording a little bit of that process of how she grows with her spiritual understanding of herself. But it's a very important point. Angela, you might want to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of her having to leave. I'm glad you mentioned the prayer journal. One of the other things that we see her struggling with, as well as trying to become a good writer, is trying to hold on to her faith. Because for the first time in her life, she's not surrounded in the safe bosom of her big Catholic family in Milledgeville. She is in the classroom and living with people, most of whom are not believers. And she says in her journal, God, please help me not to lose I am vulnerable to so much intellectual quackery. So she's trying desperately to hold on to that, and also to put together these twin vocations that she has as a writer, as an artist, and also as a believing Catholic. And what do these two things have to do with each other? And that's a struggle she probably would not have gone through if she never left that safe little, little world that she was living in, that pre-lapsarian world of Milledgeville. So Iowa challenges her spiritually as well as challenging her as a writer.
Angela, let me just stop you. You have that wonderful title in your book on Iowa City, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Woman. I mean, it really is her moment of her Daedalus moment, And so I love one of my favorite titles of a chapter. Yeah. Because Iowa is the place where she's learning what it means to be an artist.
And just to speak to Alice's statement, I bristle whenever I hear Alice say that. It's lupus who made her the writer she was, because Flannery would hate that. She says in one of her letters, I don't want reviewers to be talking about my lupus. That has nothing to do with my work. She clearly thought it was something that was very private. It was her own business. It's a lot like the way Hulga feels about her wooden leg. This is nobody's business. I'm the right of who I am, not because of some, genes, some disease. However,
Yep.
The fact is, when she was at Yaddo, and then she was living in Connecticut with the Fitzgerald family, and she's trying to finish Wise Blood, and she's having a pretty tough time. It takes her, 6 years to finish a very short book. She's trying to find her way through her first novel, and then she gets diagnosed with lupus. She needs to go back home. She has to live in rural Georgia and far away from New York City and all of those fancy literary people that she had gotten to know. And then she rediscovers her voice, the idiom, the Southern idiom that she was not hearing every day is suddenly in her ears again. It's the people who work on the farm, the people who live in the town, the people who come and visit her and her mother, Regina. And she then gets to the point where she admits later to other writer friends, I didn't want to come back here, but if I hadn't come back here, I would not have found my subject, and also recovered her idiom. So, and why else would she have come back if it weren't for the lupus? And as Mark mentioned earlier, one of the reasons O'Connor writes so well about suffering is because she suffered every single day of her life. Her bones began to deteriorate because the medication that she was taking. She had to walk on crutches. She had necrosis of the jaw and couldn't chew at times because of the degeneration of her bones. She lived the cross every day, and was able to write about suffering from a place of knowledge and experience rather than just thinking about it as some kind of theological trope that she was using in her book. So even though she might want to step away from the disease as being responsible for who she is as a writer, there's no question that it was a very, very heavy influence on what she wrote and how she wrote.
Yeah, and I always think of Alice McDermott's comment about how lupus made her reorganize her whole life, and that getting her, it got her ducks in a row for her talent, as another way of saying it. So I don't see her saying it that the lupus itself was where she sat in her creative imagination, but that the lupus was the event that really had her put everything else. I mean, everything was out of order until she got lupus. Then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I'm going to have to be a writer. I'm going to be taken care of. I'm going to write from 9 to 6. She became almost a monk in some ways, a monk's life to do this kind of work. And as you say, the Southern idiom gets fresh air again in her
and
imagination.
also the great value at 25 years old of learning that you're mortal. I always talk about this with my students who are about that age, no, everyone thinks they're immortal when they're 25. But when you get what is essentially a death sentence, she knows that they can ameliorate the disease and as much as they can, but she also watched her father die of it when she was 15 years old. So she knows that this is very serious and she doesn't have time to waste. So as Mark says, she gets her ducks in order. She knows that she has to be disciplined because she has limited time. I often think of, when I think about her lupus, I think of the Misfits' famous line at the end of A Good Man is Hard to Find, after he shoots the old lady, the main character in the story end, he says she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. And of course, that's our hope, right? Everybody knows eventually that they're going to die. It's a matter of how one dies and how one behaves in the face of death. And that was, I mean, lupus was Flannery's misfit with the gun aimed at her heart, any day you can go. And so you need to do your work now and be a good woman, be a good writer, do what it is that you have to do. So there's a kind of urgency that gets imposed on her. And she also, another beautiful, painful passage, which I mentioned in this other book, The Province of Joy, which is a series of prayers that are based on Flannery O'Connor's prayer life. And one of the passages that I found most moving when I was putting these readings together was where she talks about sickness being a country that you have to go to by yourself, and it's more instructive than any trip to Europe. And traveling through that country, you are changed by it. It's a pilgrimage that you make that is going to teach you things that nothing else can. So she knows that her illness is schooling her in all sorts, schooling her heart as well as schooling her mind.
So let me tell you the thing about Flannery that frustrates me a little bit, and I'd love to hear your response to this. In her stories, in her novel, there seems to be no room or purpose for being better, for doing better. There's only space for that radical sinfulness and that undeserved stunning grace, like you just described at the end of A Good Man Is Hard to Find. But I mean, as a Catholic myself, as a human being, I'm always trying to do better, to be better. But in O'Connor, it's almost as if there's no room for that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think Flannery O'Connor is interested in good versus bad, good or better. She's are not saved. I mean, it comes to that. I think part of it is that O'Connor is breathing in a kind of an American kind of capitalistic ethic of virtue, that we can be better and we can be greater, and this idea of the moral life in some ways. But I think she would say that her stories remind us that we're all imperfect. There is no perfectibility to the human person. It needs grace. It can't be done on your own. So I think a writer that's looking at that moral kind of lever in the equation. She's looking for, are you ready? Will you be ready? Do you have it in you as a character, as a reader? Are you going to be ready for when that flash comes, when that moment, when that mystery hits you, whether it's death or it's a gun, or if it's being left on the side of a road, or, are you going to be ready? And so it's a different kind of story. You're absolutely right. I agree with you, John. She's not, you could see I guess you see some of that maybe with Ruby Turpin. She gets to live, right? At the end of Revelation, going off with the crickets and hallelujah. So there might be something that she sees another day to be better.
To try to be better.
Yeah, to try, yeah. But I think she's really kind of like, she's really worried. She's concerned that there's something deformed in the American imagination that comes out of the triumphalism of World War II, post-World War II. And I think her stories are existentially criticizing that. At the same time, she's using this kind of Catholic sense of, I'm really interested in, are you going to be ready to be saved?
Absolutely. And it also is a rebellion against that kind of Emersonian impulse that Americans all have, that, constant self-improvement, we get better and better. Just forget the past, just have amnesia about that, leave that behind. It doesn't mean anything, and just forge ahead to the future. And, she believes in original sin. Even children in her stories, even innocent children, are terrible people. I love the story of Temple of the Holy Ghost, which is basically a self-portrait of Flannery as a little kid, because she suffers from intellectual pride. She thinks she's smarter than everybody else. She's mouthy, and she's mean to her
honoring.
mother.
I love that word. That's such a word.
She's honoring. And when she prays, she says, "Help me not to be so mean. Help me not to ask her too much," her mother. And so this child is very self-aware. She knows that she's sinful. And, again, this is basic Catholicism. Catholics go to confession for the first time when they're 7. Most Americans find this appalling. What could you possibly do wrong when you're 7? And Flannery knows, you could be doing plenty wrong when you're 7. Of course, Many of us did do lots of wrong things to our poor siblings and other people when we're 7. So she really does believe in this idea that we are just afflicted by sin. It's just who we are. We are terrible people. And even when we try to do good, or we think we're on the bus, who thinks that he's an integrationist and thinks that he's not a racist. His mother's a terrible racist, but he's not. It becomes quite evident in the course of the story that he just wants to use people. He wants to use Black Americans, African Americans, to make himself look good, and to make him think he's just a fine fellow. And same thing with Asbury Fox in the story, the Enduring Chill. It's a kind of character type, the self-congratulatory American progressive mentality, where this person is just totally deluded about his own sin. And if he's lucky, he's going to get some kind of event, usually a violent event, is going to wake him up. And he'll have, unfortunately, he'll suffer, but he'll have a chance to save himself or be saved, a chance to accept the grace that is extended to him. So, I always tell my students, and they understand this, this is hard stuff. Flannery is not for the faint of heart. And there are some readers that don't like her. And as she says, it's not for everybody. Art is not for everybody. And there are some writers who don't like her, including Marilyn Robinson, who has gone on record saying, I see very little grace in Flannery O'Connor.
What Flannery O'Connor's, you already mentioned, is a sacramental imagination. So grace is not so much the grace we see in St. Paul and Ephesians, but it's grace as revelation. It's grace as a mysterious moment where I am destabilized from my self-centeredness and I am given a gift of some kind of thing. It can be violent, and I think that's the difference between, perhaps, that's what I see the difference in a literary imagination between the Protestant imagination and the Catholic imagination. We're not looking for perfection or being better. We're not looking for the moral good in these stories. It's a good thing, but it comes out of the quest of the Protestant imagination. We're looking at, do we have the eyes to see, reveal what's underneath or within or behind an event or a person? And O'Connor is so sacramental that's where grace actually exists for her. It's a different kind of understanding of grace than you might get from a normal, sense of it.
Absolutely.
So Angela, I'd like you to read a couple more poems if you're willing. And then I do have a few questions from people who are watching that I will pose to the two of you. But Angela, I had flagged 2. One is Flannery and James, and this is again from Angela's beautiful book of Flannery poems, Andalusian Hours. Flannery and James, which is on page 36, and Flannery's Violence on page 65.
Absolutely, I would love to read those. The Flannery and James poem, the backstory behind these poems, by the way, are all sonnets that are spoken supposedly by Flannery O'Connor. I am channeling her voice. And each of the poems begins with an epigraph that comes from one of O'Connor's letters or one of her essays or one of her stories. Those of us who read Flannery know that she says the darndest things, says the most interesting things. And these poems were an opportunity to sort of plumb the depths or plumb some of the background behind what it is that Flannery might mean when she says the things that she says. So in this particular poem, Flannery and James, the James in the poem is James Baldwin. Flannery O'Connor received from a friend of hers the invitation or the suggestion that James Baldwin come to visit her, the African-American writer, great African-American writer and activist James Baldwin, come to visit her in Georgia when he was making a tour through the South. And Flannery O'Connor answered him, and this answer has since become quite famous, quite infamous in some places. She says, "No, I can't see James Baldwin in Georgia. It would cause the greatest trouble and disturbance and disunion. In New York, it would be nice to meet him, but here it would not. I observe the traditions of the society I feed upon. It's only fair. Might as well expect a mule to fly as me to see James Baldwin in Georgia." April 25th, 1959. It's not as if he ain't a good man, or that much of what he says ain't true. You imagine him easing on my porch, Regina serving cake and sweet tea, three of us chatting like old friends. But where I live, we kill our prophets, beat and butcher them, hang them from the trees. Queer or Catholic, Negro or Jew, there's plenty of hate to go around and nothing I can do to stop it. Where there's gasoline, you, where there's rednecks, you don't fire off a round. I choose to tell the truth in quieter ways. We both live to fight another day. O'Connor knew, of course, that she lives in Klan country, and for her to bring James Baldwin to her house would upset her neighbors tremendously to the point of possible violence. So she's doing it for his protection, for her protection, for her community's protection. But another element at work here when she says the society, I found Flannery is a spy in the enemy country. She is a reporter. She's listening. She's eavesdropping on people, and she's writing stories about them. And if she were to out herself as a integrationist, all that would be gone. She would be an outsider in her community. So she has multiple reasons for not inviting James Baldwin. It's not as simple as it looks. So when people talk about Flannery and race and they point to this particular episode as showing her racism, they're just wrong about that.
Yeah, I agree. They're completely wrong about it.
Yep. And then the other poem that John asked me to read, I'm very happy to read. It's called Flannery's Violence. And the reason I use the word violence is because O'Connor says in one of her letters or in one of her essays that her characters' heads are so hard. There's so much in need of grace that usually it takes some kind of violence to wake them up to their need for that grace. And so she uses violence in her stories famously. She says in one of her stories, A Circle in the Fire, ladies, don't beat the daylight out of people. The lesson every Southern girl must learn if she's to grow up straight and proper. But somehow I have always been bent on fisticuffs. Guardian angels and nuns, dumb country boys, foolish country women have long been objects of my quiet ire. Even Christ used a whip when he needed to. His mother never told him what to do, and when she did, he didn't like to listen. I had to find another way to vent. Stomp along the floors with my wooden leg, hold folks at gunpoint and make them beg for their lives. I've learned how to write my rage, beat the daylight out of people on the page.
Great story. Great
I
poem.
need to get to some questions that people have here. And the first one, it came very early as the two of you started talking. And it's a good one. It's from an anonymous attendee. And they say, is there anything Flannery can teach us about friendship across ideological boundaries in our current time of polarization? Or is she too peculiar an individual or too compromised by her acquiescence to Southern racism?
That's a great question. I'll start, Mark, and then you want to.
Sure.
She had friendships with all kinds of people. And she, as we know, she had to go back to Georgia to, be taken care of by her mother when she had lupus. So her only contact with the outside world was through letters. She wrote many, many letters to many different kinds of people, including her, who was a playwright, a Southerner who had transplanted to New York, and very liberal, very much part of the civil rights movement. She's writing plays about African Americans. She and Flannery were opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their ideas about how it is that the civil rights movement, civil rights should come about. And they would argue about this in a very friendly and sometimes kind of outrageous way in their letters, but they were very dear to each other. She was also friends with Betty Hester, who she met, because they both were interested in stories that had to do with God. And Betty Hester had been discharged from the Army, or one of the armed services. Flannery eventually learned because she was a lesbian. And it was a dishonorable discharge. And Betty took a long time before she revealed this to Flannery. And when she did, she was very apprehensive. Flannery is a very conservative Catholic. She imagines she might reject her. And Flannery says, "You set your mind at ease. I feel nothing but love for you." So even though these folk are about as different from Flannery as could be ideologically, personally, personality-wise. Flannery had a very broad spectrum of appreciation for all kinds of weirdos, as her stories would suggest. She herself was a weirdo. She was a freak. We're all freaks in a way, and she's not in a position to judge.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so.
I would agree. When I first read all of Flannery O'Connor's stories, I had not read The Habit of Being, and I admired her, but I thought I would be afraid to be her friend because of it. Oh my God! And then I read The Habit of Being, and it completely turned around. And her humanity, her dedication to friends, and her friends would teach her. I would argue that her friendship with Mariette Lee was helping her figure out how to deal with race. That she trusted Mariette Lee so much, even in kidding, that Mariette could prod her to think out of the safe categories that was part of her Southern milieu. So I think if you read The Habit of Being, boy, well, I fell in love with Flannery O'Connor by reading The Habit of Being. So there's something about her that you see. She allows intimacy, professional with her friends. She wants to say, I'm trusting with this, and they're trusting her with themselves. And as you said, a bisexual, a lesbian, converts, people who've left the Catholic Church completely. She was able to be quite a human being to them and their humanness, and really, I think, loved and cared for them. She probably prayed for some of them. I know she prayed for Cal Lowell all the time. Anytime, I think she would do anything for him. She would do anything for her friends that she could. So, yeah.
All right, now there's at least 3 more questions I want to make sure we get to. There are several people who want the two of you to address the accusations of racism. Now, you've done that a little bit already when Angela was reading the James Baldwin poem. But for instance, Anthony Azarto, a Jesuit, says, what about the charge of racism? He refers to the fact that Loyola College removed her name from a dorm. I know that the two of you, Mark and Angela, have been involved in public conversations about that. What do you think about that? And what do you think about the accusations of racism?
Very complex.
Yeah. Angela's written this book on it, so I can let her speak. But what I found out from doing the film and really exploring every piece of and putting context to everything that's been used to say that this shows her racism, is that Flannery O'Connor was definitely fighting what we would now call the kind of the white presumptions of her class, and being the assumptions of whiteness. And what that meant is that she, I think, had a kind of the background of her life, if you're on a play, is this racist milieu, this racist country. O'Connor is always trying to leave the background into the forefront, and she interrogates that in her stories. I think I like to use the word that Bruce Gentry has used once before, that O'Connor is a recovering racist, if she's any kind of racist. She's always aware that because of her Catholic faith, that there's something wrong with this. Now, being a segregationist, integrationist, whatever, she plays with that, but she plays it with one person in particular, Mariette Lee. She really only uses the N-word in that kind of explosive way with 2 people that I can find in the letters, kind of habitually. And it's always because it's a kind of setting up a kind of a frame for their conversations. It's really not about the racism in particular. It's about some of the effects of what do we do as a white person with all these kinds of privileges. How do I see differently? And so that's how I would say it. I would not say that O'Connor, and I think Angela actually disagrees with me. She's much more nuanced. I would not call Flannery O'Connor a racist. I would call her a recovering racist, recovering every time that she forgets the plight of others that are not like her.
I did, I agree with much of what Mark says. I recently published this book, Radical Ambivalence, which was the book that kind of set off that New Yorker article last July. And the person who wrote that article kind of misunderstood my book. And so what I really argue in the book basically is you've got O'Connor speaking in her letters in a way that suggests that, yes, she is a recovering racist is one way to put it. A cultural racist is another way to put it. She had inherited from her, the time that she was born, this deep-seated racism that was part of Southern culture. It's just the way that people spoke and the air she breathed, and it would be a miracle if she escaped it. Just as it would be a miracle if any white person who lives in the culture now, which is profoundly shaped by white privilege, all of us to some extent have inherited this once we're born. We don't have it before that, but once we're born, we're immersed in it. And even if we have the best of parents, we see the way that the world works around us, and we internalize that white supremacy, and we need to kind of fight against it. O'Connor was no different. In many ways, she's kind of like most white people, only it's more explicit, and she was very aware of it. So in her letters, we get this kind of patter, which is sometimes humorous with her friend Mariette Lee, where she's teasing her friend for being a progressive. But she does make it quite clear that she's civil rights being enacted too quickly. She's concerned about the decay of the culture around her. She's afraid she doesn't know what exactly is going on. She was a person of her moment, like a lot of Southern people, including William Faulkner, including any number of other Southerners who were also Northerners were concerned about this. I think it's important to remember that O'Connor died in 1964, right before the Civil Rights Act was enacted. She was 39 years old, frozen in time at the age of 39. As Hilton Alls recently said in an interview, who knows who they are when they're 35? It takes a lifetime. And there's no doubt in my mind that if Flannery were with us today, turning 96, she would have very different ideas about civil rights and about African Americans and whites than she did when she was 39. However, we do have these two sets of writings. We have the letters in which we see the everyday, the political, the social Flannery speaking in a particular way. And then we have the stories. And the stories are remarkable because she does exactly what Mark said that they do. She interrogates white supremacy. She interrogates racism. She takes off the mask and she exposes the evilness and the ugliness of white supremacy and of racism. Time after time after time. There's something that happens to an artist when they're writing a story or a work of art that's different when you're sitting down to write a letter. When you're writing a letter, it's like, yeah, 12 o'clock, I'm writing a letter to my friend. I'm just jotting something and sending it off. When you're sitting down to write a story, you're writing for the ages. You're writing in the face of eternity. You're writing like you're writing for God. It's a different kind of expression. And I think it's a mistake to, first of all, the title of my book is Radical Ambivalence, meaning that you literally can feel, you can have mixed feelings. You can have very same subjects at one time or another. And that's what we see in O'Connor. And I think if we're honest, that's true of most people, especially when it comes to something as difficult as the subject of race. So I think that the article in the Fury last summer was really unfortunate in trying to expose something in O'Connor that is, is human. It's who we all are. And if we tried to get rid of all of our writers that were double-minded about race, there'd be no one left.
Thank you. All right, so there's really three more things that people would love for us to get to. I know we have 4 minutes left until we're at the top of the hour. I want to respect your time. If you're willing to go a few minutes extra, then we will, but I'm going to leave that up to you, Mark and Angela. Someone wants you to talk about the cartoons and the humor in O'Connor. Someone wants you to talk about, have you seen any progression or changes in the perception of Flannery since the film originally came out last summer and since your book was published, Angela, the one that you were just referring to? Are there any changes going on in the conversation about Flannery O'Connor? And then someone also wants you to reflect on the Christ-haunted South. Did Flannery coin that term, and or did she influence Walker Percy? So there you go.
Wow. Okay. All in 4 minutes. Well, let me talk. Maybe I can take the cartoons then. and we can move into Angela to answer the part 2 or part 3 of those things. So one of the things that was great going to the archives was picking up, these little books that she did. I mean, she was 7, 8, and 9 years old when these are all being done, and just talk about the talent, there with her little markers and her little things. And you see her right sense of humor. Of course, she wanted to be a cartoonist. One of the reasons why we put animations in our film is because we said, oh, here we have an artist who really thought she was first going to be a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine. So kind of paying homage to the fact that that's already in the biography of O'Connor. We did do that. We did animate some of her short stories. So yes, I think that was really wonderful. I was just amazed by how much we found of her early life there. And that's where we also found the journal, her high school, college journal, Higher Mathematics, which was at the bottom. We'd always known about it. Sally Fitzgerald had spoken about it, Billy Sessions had spoken about it, but nobody had actually seen it. So it was just so wonderful to take it out of the box and have it in our film. To you, next question, Angela, go ahead for it.
I feel like I'm a batter and they just keep getting thrown at me. I can't remember the middle question. Yeah, development since the film. Well, it's interesting. When I was being interviewed for the film, when I was in Iowa with Mark and with the rest of the team, I had really just started on the project. I hadn't even gotten to the archives yet. And so, that was not a question that we actually engaged. We were mostly just building O'Connor's biography, talking about her time in Iowa. We really weren't talking about race. And I wonder if we would have done it. Well, I certainly probably would have spoken differently at the time because I didn't know as much as I know now. And that probably would have come up more. If not, it may not have shown up in the film ultimately, but it would have come up in our conversation. So Mark is the filmmaker. He knows better than I do whether this is true or not. But I have a feeling that it might be a little bit different. I mean, the film was finished before George Floyd was killed, right? Last May. I mean, and that really, my goodness. Of course, this has been going on for a long time in the United States, and we know it, but it was never made undeniably clear to us what was going on with that horrific image of a man being murdered on screen.
May I just add something? So I remember when Black Lives Matter started in 2015, we were well into our film, and I remember sitting down with my colleague Elizabeth Kaufman and saying, really kind of absorbing this moment of Black Lives Matter, and I said, I don't know enough about the racism. I know that she used the N-word, and I know all of what we knew from The Habit of Being. And so we decided that had to be I wouldn't say it had to be a much larger, but we wanted to explore it more as filmmakers and try to fit it into an 85-minute film, right? And so that really did. So it was before George Floyd, but I do remember sitting and saying, wow, O'Connor matters now in a new way because of Black Lives Matter. That all of a sudden she actually matters because some things have not even changed. The mechanisms in her stories are the exact same mechanisms that we're seeing today. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. So when we're reading a story like Everything That Rises Must Converge, it takes place on the bus, and we have this whole spectrum of different kinds of racism, from the lady who believes in the old South ways that slaves were happy and it's a darn shame what happened to her liberal son, who thinks that he's a racist. He's not a racist, but he is. He's probably worse than his mother because he doesn't know it. And then, of course, the African-American woman who has been the victim of all of this and is just sick and tired of it, and is not going to put up with it anymore. And O'Connor brings these three people together. And of course, there's going to be a violent convergence. That's what we get. And what have we been getting for the last few years on a horribly regular basis? And what did we get on May 25th? The horrible convergence of exactly these different types of people. And it's just O'Connor's view was this is just going to happen over and over and over again, because people are deeply sinful. And we try, and one of the reasons she had a problem with civil rights is she thought this is just a band-aid. This is really not going to fix the problem. And so, she really is taking the long vision rather than trying to do things in the immediate, future that and there's no doubt we've gotten better. Our society is better. It's more just than it was, but it's still not just. As Martin Luther King says, the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards justice. The emphasis in that statement being long, and we're nowhere near. She was right. We're nowhere near where we want to be. So that was not the solution that people thought it was. And then the last thing was the Christ-haunted South. And Flannery, that's what she said. She said, the South is certainly not necessarily Christ-centered, but it is Christ-haunted. And in that regard, one of her best essays, if you're looking for a good essay to read by O'Connor, is the Catholic novelist in the Protestant South. And in that essay, she talks about the fact that she really appreciates being a Southern Catholic. Because, as you know, when she was there were not very many Catholics. She was like an exile and a weirdo for being a Catholic in the Protestant South. But she loved the fact that Southerners were conversant with the Bible. They knew the stories. And she could use a name, she could allude to something, she could make something happen in her stories, and Protestant readers would get it immediately. Catholics, not so much. We don't read the Bible as much as Protestants do. So she deeply appreciated the language and the ways in which Southerners were absolutely steeped in the Bible, and that was fodder for her story. And Mark might want to add to either of those points.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think the hauntedness, there is something haunting, grotesque about the world that she puts before us. Although, as O'Connor would say, this is just my observation. She says, I found Ruby Turpin on an elevator. So the thing I think, I'm from St. Louis, Chicago, now DC. I think, there's that weird world down in the South that they're so strange, that that's Southern Gothic. But you know what? I think we project that on the South. I think there's a lot of grotesqueries about who we are, and we have to live and we have to own those as well. So, but the South knows they're haunted. There's a sense that they know that something's missing. There's a sense that the absence is felt. Whereas I think most of the United States would say, I don't even sense it.
Thank you.
It's lost.
And Mark and Angela, if you haven't looked at the chat, I encourage you to do that, because there's a few people complimenting you and saying personal things to you. Rachel, I would encourage you to come back on and close us out, and I'll just say, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Angela.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you, John.
It's such a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Just a quick note to everyone who's here today that if you would like to add any of Angela's books with Paraclete to your library, those are available from paracletepress.com. We always encourage you to visit your local bookstore. And if they don't carry the books, let us know at Paraclete. We'll be happy to help. Happy birthday, Flannery. Thank you again, Father Mark, John, Angela. So appreciate you having this conversation with us today.
Absolutely. Happy birthday, Flannery.
Happy birthday, Flannery.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao.